Daniel and Sofia looked like the perfect newlyweds, but just 2 weeks into their marriage, a shocking secret unraveled their love story and turned their honeymoon dream into a nightmare of betrayal, rage, and murder.
Act.
Daniel and Sofia's wedding was the kind of event that left people talking for weeks. The ceremony had been elegant, with glowing lights, smiling faces, and promises of forever exchange before a crowd of friends and family. Guests spoke of how radiant Sofia looked, her gown flowing like silk waves, and how proud Daniel appeared as he held her hand tightly. To everyone watching, the couple seemed perfectly matched to people who had found their other half in a world where such love was rare. Their story had the kind of fairy tale quality that people admired and envied. The first days of their marriage carried that same aura of happiness. They shared laughter as they unpacked wedding gifts, made plans for their future together, and soaked in the joy of calling each other husband and wife. Their honeymoon destination only added to the magic. The ocean breeze, the warm sunsets, and the luxury of a new shared life seemed to promise a bright future. To Daniel, every detail was evidence that he had made the right choice, that Sofia was the woman who would complete his life. He had fallen in love quickly, swept away by her charm and beauty, and marriage felt like a natural step. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear in the picture-perfect surface. Daniel noticed things about Sofia that unsettled him, seemed hesitant in certain intimate moments, avoiding closeness with carefully placed excuses. Sometimes, when he reached for her, she would retreat ever so slightly, masking her discomfort with a nervous laugh or a sudden change of topic. At first, Daniel brushed it off, attributing it to nerves or the overwhelming nature of being newly married. He told himself that not all relationships flowed easily from the start, and that love meant patience. Still, doubts began to creep into his mind. Sofia had always been private, even during their courtship, and while Daniel had admired her mysteriousness before, now it seemed like a barrier. He started replaying past moments in his head, times when she had avoided deep conversations or redirected his questions about her past. These recollections, once insignificant, began to take on new meaning, as he considered the possibility that she was hiding something important from him. Despite the growing unease, Daniel pushed forward with their honeymoon. They took long walks along the beach, shared meals at candlelit tables, and posed for photographs that painted them as the ideal couple. Yet behind Daniel's smile was a restless mind, questioning the distance he felt from his wife. He noticed the way she guarded herself, and the way her eyes sometimes betrayed a flicker of fear when he tried to break through her walls. By the end of the second week, what had started as a dream was clouded with uncertainty. Daniel could not shake the feeling that Sofia was keeping a part of herself locked away, something essential that stood between them and true intimacy. His love for her was still there, but it was tangled now with suspicion. That suspicion grew stronger with each passing day, transforming the joy of marriage into a haunting curiosity that demanded answers. What Daniel didn't yet know was that the secret Sofia carried was larger than anything he could have imagined, and once uncovered, it would ignite a chain of events that could never be undone. One quiet afternoon during their honeymoon, Daniel's life took a sudden turn when curiosity and unease drove him to a discovery he would never forget. Sofia had stepped out to run an errand, leaving her small travel bag tucked neatly under the bed. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who liked to pry, but something about her guarded behavior over the past days pushed him toward suspicion. He told himself it was harmless, just a way to ease his growing doubts. Yet, when he unzipped the bag, what he found was anything but harmless. Inside were documents, medical papers, identification records, and personal notes that revealed a truth Sofia had never shared. She was transgender, and though she lived as a woman, she had not undergone genital surgery. Daniel froze as his eyes scanned the words, his mind refusing to process them at first. Shock rolled through him like a tidal wave, leaving him breathless. The woman he had married, the bride he had shown off proudly at their wedding, was not who he believed she was. The revelation dismantled everything Daniel thought he knew. He recalled the intimacy she avoided, the way her hands trembled when he pressed her for closeness, and the nervous energy she carried in quiet moments. What he once dismissed as shyness or nerves now felt like deliberate concealment. His love story, which had seemed pure and perfect, suddenly twisted into something he perceived as deception. Daniel's emotions spiraled rapidly. Confusion struck first, making him question whether he had misread the documents, whether there was some other explanation. But as he read more, the truth became undeniable. Soon after, anger surged. To him, this was not simply a private matter. This was betrayal. He replayed their wedding day in his mind, imagining the vows she had spoken, the promises she had made, and the secrecy that lay beneath them. The humiliation he felt was profound, as though every smile and congratulation from friends and family had been built on a lie. He thought about what people would say if they ever discovered this truth. He pictured the whispers, the judgment, the pity that would follow him everywhere. It wasn't just Sofia's secret he carried now, was a burden he believed would stain his own reputation. His thoughts grew darker the longer he sat with the documents, his imagination filling in gaps with fears and suspicions. Every detail of their relationship became suspect, every moment of affection recast as manipulation. When Sofia returned later that day, Daniel said nothing. He carefully placed the documents back into the bag and pretended everything was normal. Outwardly, he played the role of a calm husband, but inside he was seething. His silence was not forgiveness, it was strategy. He decided to wait, to process, to let his fury take shape before acting. For the rest of their honeymoon, he looked at his wife differently. The tenderness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold detachment she couldn't quite name. What Daniel didn't realize was that his silence was more dangerous than confrontation. Every hour he held the secret inside, the anger grew sharper, poisoning his thoughts and reshaping his love into something unrecognizable. By the time they returned home, his heart was no longer filled with devotion, but with a simmering rage that would soon erupt. When Daniel and Sofia returned home from their honeymoon, the atmosphere in their house shifted almost immediately. To outsiders, the newlyweds appeared like any other couple, settling into married life. But inside those walls, the tension was thick and undeniable. Sofia tried to hold on to the joy of being a bride, decorating their living space, preparing meals, and speaking of the future with a hopeful tone. Yet her efforts were met with a growing distance from Daniel. His warmth had cooled into silence, his affectionate touches replaced by cold stares, once frequent, had completely disappeared. Daniel was drowning in his thoughts, replaying what he had discovered over and over again. Each time he saw Sofia, he no longer saw the woman he fell in love with. Instead, he saw the hidden truth he believed she had deliberately kept from him. He watched her every move with suspicion, searching for signs of deceit, as though everything she did now carried double meaning. Nights were the worst. He lay awake, staring into the dark, imagining the humiliation he would face if the world discovered her secret. Shame and anger gnawed at him like relentless shadows, and sleep offered no escape. Sofia, unaware that her husband had uncovered her documents, grew increasingly concerned by his behavior. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on her but lacked tenderness, the way his silence filled the room like a heavy weight. She attempted to bridge the gap with small gestures, preparing his favorite meals, suggesting outings and offering affection, but her kindness only deepened his bitterness. To Daniel, those gestures felt like lies wrapped in pretty paper, designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The more she tried, the more his resentment grew. In his mind, she had robbed him of choice, stolen his ability to decide whether he wanted this marriage under full knowledge of her identity. He convinced himself that she had trapped him, forcing him into a situation that would eventually expose him to ridicule. The fear of others finding out consumed him more than the marriage itself. He began to see Sofia not as a partner, but as a threat to his pride and reputation. Days turned into a tense routine of avoidance. Daniel spent more time away from home, burying himself in errands and distractions, while Sofia remained hopeful that he just needed space. But even in her hope, a quiet dread lingered. She felt the emotional distance widening, though she could not name its cause. Each evening when Daniel returned, the silence between them grew heavier, like a storm gathering force. Daniel's rage, however, was no longer a fleeting emotion. It had begun to crystallize into something more dangerous. He no longer thought in terms of reconciliation or even escape. Divorce or separation might have been options, but in his mind, they weren't enough. His pride demanded something harsher, something final. He began to fantasize about what it would feel like to put an end to the source of his humiliation. What had started as shock and anger was now transforming into violent obsession. Sofia, still unaware of the storm she lived beside, continued her life under the same roof, never realizing that each passing day brought her closer to a tragedy she could not escape. One evening, the fragile balance inside their home shattered completely. Daniel had been keeping his fury bottled up for days, but that night it spilled over in a way that changed everything. The silence between him and Sofia had become unbearable, suffocating the house with an energy that neither of them could ignore. Sofia, desperate to understand, attempted to draw him into conversation, to ask what was wrong, to salvage the love that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. But to Daniel, her concern only felt like another layer of deceit. In his mind, every gentle word she spoke was a manipulation, every smile a mask hiding betrayal. As her questions grew more insistent, his composure cracked. The storm of emotions he had been suppressing erupted, and the carefully hidden truth burst into the open. He revealed what he had discovered during their honeymoon, his words sharp and venomous, his anger finally given voice. Sofia was stunned, her face draining of color as she realized what he knew. The secret she had hoped to share on her own terms was no longer her on it, had been unearthed, twisted and weaponized against her. For Daniel, this confrontation was a release. He hurled accusations, framing her identity as a deliberate trap, a crime against his trust, and a stain on his reputation. To him, the marriage was no longer a union of love, but a cruel betrayal that mocked his dignity. Sofia tried to explain, to reach through the rage with honesty and vulnerability, but her words fell against a wall of fury too thick to penetrate. In Daniel's mind, no explanation could erase what he saw as a humiliation of the highest order. The confrontation escalated quickly. The house, once a symbol of their new beginning, became a cage filled with shouts and trembling fear. Daniel's anger took physical form, slamming doors, shattering objects, pacing the room like a predator cornering its prey. Sofia's fear was palpable. She could see in his eyes that this was no ordinary argument. There was a darkness there, something dangerous and consuming, something that no apology or plea could soften. In those moments, the marriage was no longer a partnership, became a battlefield, and Sofia, once cherished as a bride, became the embodiment of Daniel's anger. Every ounce of affection that once bound them together had curdled into hatred. He no longer saw her as the woman he once loved, but as the source of his humiliation and shame. That night ended without violence, but the damage was irreversible. Daniel had crossed a threshold within himself, speaking thoughts that could not be taken back, giving voice to the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface. For Sofia, the confrontation marked the beginning of her deepest fear. She now understood the danger she was in, though she underestimated how far Daniel's rage would push him. The silence that followed the storm was even more ominous than the shouting. Their home, once filled with wedding decorations and remnants of honeymoon bliss, now echoed with tension and dread. The fragile thread that held their marriage together had snapped, and what replaced it was a dangerous void, one that would soon be filled by an irreversible act of violence. The days that followed the explosive confrontation were marked by a haunting stillness. Daniel withdrew further into himself, carrying a coldness that left Sofia unsettled. He tried to cling to the fragments of their marriage, holding on to hope that time might heal the wound now split wide open. But beneath her attempts at normalcy, she lived with a gnawing fear. She saw the way his eyes lingered on her, not with affection, but with something sharp and calculating. The home they had shared so briefly now felt unsafe, each hallway and room heavy with unspoken threats. Daniel, meanwhile, was consumed by thoughts he could no longer control. The discovery had set something in motion that he felt powerless to stop. His anger had hardened into obsession, and obsession into a plan. Divorce, separation, or secrecy no longer seemed like answers. In his mind, the only way to erase the betrayal and protect himself from imagined shame was to remove Sofia entirely. The idea grew clearer with each sleepless night, taking root like a poisonous vine that spread through his thoughts, until there was no room for anything else. Sofia noticed his absence more and more, spent hours outside the house, returning with a grim expression and empty words about errands or work. But the truth was that Daniel was preparing himself, mentally rehearsing the steps he believed would restore his dignity. He avoided Sofia's eyes, not because of guilt, but because he had already reduced her, in his mind, to an obstacle rather than a partner. One evening, the weight of his decision solidified. Sofia had been setting the table for dinner, her movements calm and hopeful, as if she were still trying to mend what had broken. But Daniel's mind was elsewhere, coldly fixated on the act he believed was inevitable. He studied her as she moved, her every gesture only fueling the storm inside him. What once had drawn him to her now served as a reminder of the secret he could not forgive. That night, while the world outside slept, the walls of their home bore witness to the breaking point. Daniel acted on the darkness that had been building for weeks. The details of the moment were swift and merciless, fueled not by passion but by the twisted logic of a man who felt cornered by betrayal and shame. For Sofia, there was no chance to escape or defend herself. The same walls that had once sheltered their love now became silent witnesses to violence. When it was over, Daniel stood in the silence, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. The house was still, but not with peace only, with the chilling finality of an irreversible act. The bride he had once celebrated was gone. Her life stolen in the very place that was meant to be the beginning of their shared future. Daniel's fury had consumed everything, leaving only the hollow remains of a marriage that had lasted just 2 weeks before collapsing into tragedy. In the hours that followed, he began to understand the enormity of what he had done. But rather than remorse, he felt an eerie emptiness. The act he believed would free him from shame had only bound him tighter to the darkness he carried. The story that began as a dream union had ended in horror, and the walls of their home held the silence of a secret too heavy to keep hidden for long. Morning light crept slowly into the house, illuminating the grim reality of what Daniel had done. The silence that lingered in the rooms was unnatural, a void where life had once existed. For a brief moment, he stood frozen, staring at the aftermath of his violence, his mind numb as if the weight of the act had dulled his ability to think. But as the hours passed, the enormity of what had happened began to settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The body of his wife was no longer just a reminder of betrayal. It was evidence undeniable and damning. Panic seeped into Daniel's thoughts. He knew it would only be a matter of time before someone noticed Sofia's absence. Neighbors, friends, or even family might begin to ask questions. The honeymoon glow had not yet worn off in the eyes of those around them. People expected them to be inseparable. The thought of those questions terrified him. He scrambled to consider ways to cover his tracks, pacing the house, his hands shaking as he tried to form a plan. He considered staging an accident, imagining how he could disguise the crime as a sudden misfortune. But every scenario unraveled in his head. Too many details would raise suspicion. Too many people had seen them together, newly married and full of plans. He thought about fleeing, leaving the house and abandoning everything, but even that seemed impossible. The world outside felt hostile, ready to catch him at every turn. Meanwhile, Sofia's absence was already beginning to ripple outward. She had friends who expected calls, routines she never skipped, and a personality too warm to simply vanish without explanation. Within a day, questions began to form. Messages went unanswered, phones rang without response, and the silence surrounding her grew louder with each passing hour. It wasn't long before those closest to her began reaching out to Daniel directly, demanding to know where she was. His answers were clumsy, full of contradictions. He claimed she was resting, that she was overwhelmed, that she had decided to visit a friend. Each lie made the next harder to sustain. Whispers of suspicion began to form among those who knew them. Sofia's friends described her as excited about the future, unable to imagine her simply disappearing. The inconsistencies in Daniel's story began to expose the cracks in his facade. It didn't take long for law enforcement to be drawn in. A missing persons report was filed, and investigators turned their attention to the person closest to her, her new husband. The police arrived at the house asking questions Daniel struggled to answer. The inconsistencies piled up quickly. Neighbors recalled shouting, others noticed his strange behavior. The lack of any sign that Sofia had left on her own painted a grim picture. As investigators searched, the truth could not remain hidden. Evidence tied him directly to the crime, and the house itself betrayed him. Daniel's desperate attempts to maintain control crumbled under the weight of undeniable facts. What had begun as a marriage full of promise had spiraled into a story of deception, violence, and tragic loss. In the end, Daniel's rage had not only destroyed the woman he once loved, but also stripped him of his freedom and future. The dream of their marriage had collapsed into a nightmare that ended in handcuffs, headlines, and heartbreak. Sofia's story, though cut short, became a haunting reminder of how secrets, fear, and uncontrolled anger can twist love into something monstrous, leaving devastation in its wake.